I'm Dr. Dan Cox, a professor of counseling psychology at the University of British Columbia, and welcome to Psychotherapy and Applied Psychology, where we explore practical insights with leading experts. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome back Dr. Terry Tracey, a world authority on interests. In our conversation, we discuss how interests develop, the impact of gender on career choices, applying interests in psychotherapy, balancing client needs and societal expectations, and much more. And please feel free to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this conversation, it'd be much appreciated if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. This episode starts with Dr. Tracey responding to my question about if sex differences and interests are hardwired or learned. Let's jump in.
No one's going to be able to answer that, I don't think, in the next 50 years. Let me kind of redefine that. Are they universal?
Right. Are they consistent across cultures? Is that how we would think about that?
Consistent across cultures. I mean, in terms of, nature nurture issue, come on, we've been debating that forever. And I've gone, it's been a cornerstone for our field in all sorts of ways. Even with my kids, it's kind of like I've given the girls like trucks and things and things like that, much to my chagrin. They, my favorite, I had a student who talked about she was going to make her girl an engineer. So she brought her trucks and things and everything. And one day she came and she didn't buy her any dolls. She came out and she saw her daughter playing with the trucks, and the trucks were talking to each other and having tea. And she said, I give up. I don't know. So we do know from the heritability studies that, about 40% of interests are heritable. Again, given the caveats about heritability research. So I don't see us as doing this, but looking at these things across cultures can kind of provide an idea of some of that. The problem with doing any cross-cultural research using any assessments are many times we just can't translate scales into different languages. We have to do a whole lot of work in terms of validating them in those contexts. And, one of the things that I have done is doing a lot of work in international assessment. And many times, many of the scales just do not work when we translate them and take them out. It's extremely expensive to develop scales, so it's easy to understand why people just translate it and give it, but they don't work often. But so some of the research I did, and these have problems too. Some recent ones we had a chance where Time Magazine had a website, and they do things to kind of ask. They give out little questionnaires to their readers. And so we put out a short version of the PGI on this for about a week. And we had 200,000 responses from 79 countries with at least 30 people of those. We had a bunch of others. So again, one caveat of this is it's all in English. So we know it works in English, but we don't know that it works in other things. It would be very cumbersome to try and get 79 locally validated scales. So that's a caveat. But what we found was that, across all of these countries, people things really the gender difference was 1.04. So it was very similar to how it is in the U.S. So it exists all across the world. What we did find, though, that this was kind of moderated. And by that, I mean some countries are higher, some countries are lower, and by what? And we found that, I got my little notes here because I can't remember these things off the top of my head. Countries that are wealthier, the difference was less. Countries that were more supportive of women. The UN has a measure for all the countries about, it goes from 0 to 1. It captures how the ratio of men to women working, the visibility of women in political positions, support for women's health, a variety of things. And so the countries that were higher on support for women also, these were less. So versus countries where these things, the poorer countries, and where the countries that were more, say, traditionally male dominated, there are more dramatic people things differences. This runs somewhat counter to a good study done by Stott and Geary, maybe 5-6 years ago. They also did an international study, but they looked at aspirations. What do you want to be? What are you studying? Those kind of things. And they found that countries that were wealthier had the opposite effect, such that the wealthier countries, people things differences were greater. So there are many more women in people's type occupation, had people aspirations in wealthy countries than they did in poorer countries. And I think this is somewhat a function of focus on aspirations versus interests. Aspirations is kind of like taking account of person environment match. These are things that I want to be doing. And so these are things that I'm going to be choosing to do. And so that's not determined just by interest, but many other things. Can I get a job in this? Is this reasonable? Is this possible to be done? And I think that's kind of why these results are different, because there are many more constraints in some of the poorer countries. One of the things I found, what started me in this whole thing was I'm over giving some talks about interest in Taiwan and China, and I'm talking about, this gender effect, and I'm talking about why it's a big deal in the U.S. because of STEM. And they just looked at me and they said, "What?" And I go, "Yeah, it's women are underrepresented in STEM occupations." They said, "What?" It's not at all true there. They are as represented, if not more represented. And so, I'm going like, well, why? And so it's not an issue of the interest per se, it's an issue of the constraints. There, from kind of talking to a lot of people, I really got in terms of making their choice, it had little to do with interest because they felt that they couldn't afford that. They had to choose occupations that paid well and that there was some opportunity to move ahead for them and their families. So in other words, they were driven by external constraints to choose things. And so I think what we get is interests are important to pay off, but they don't determine what you go into. That's where society's constraints can come in and play. And that's kind of because I remember I was talking to several people there, and like I met a bunch of, giving a talk about interests, and I met a bunch of women who were 35, 38. And this is like 7 people I met in this boat, very successful engineers and scientists. They didn't like their jobs. And so they were kind of going, "Oh, I can think about things differently," because they wanted much more. This is where that people things came in. They wanted much more people contact, and they felt very dissatisfied with their jobs, even though they were remarkably successful. And so there would be a case of, yes, they were successful, but they were not satisfied, and they weren't satisfied because the job didn't match their interests. But they went into it for constraints of that culture. And so cultures really do constrain what we can choose. The interests are still there, but they can kind of do it. So that's why this finding was cultures that were richer had, in a sense, the jobs represented the interest differences. So there were many more women in S jobs in the societies that were wealthier.
Which is, but in your large study, where you were looking at interest, not in the jobs that they get,
Right,
just
right.
the
So that's the
interests.
difference. So there still is this interest difference. But I think what happens is societies kind of constrain how much we actually use those interests in terms of the job selection.
So for your study, where you found that in wealthier nations, and I would imagine that, and I forget the language that you use, basically, I don't know, empowering women or something like that. That I would imagine there's a correlation between the nations that are more likely to empower women and the nations that are wealthy. That those two things go together to some extent.
They're correlated, but they're not
Oh, interesting.
isomorphic.
Okay, so the women. So let's talk about then just the nations that are more about empowering women. So in that case, you found that the ones that were more empowering with women, that the gender difference was less in terms of interests.
Still there.
Like,
Still
right. Well,
big.
so that's what I was going to ask. Like, how much less? And I'm not asking for a specific effect size, but more like a ballpark. Like, does it go down to zero point 0.1 standard deviation instead of one standard deviation,
No, no,
or is
no,
it
no,
more
no,
like?
no. The scale is much smaller. I could, no, it would
Yeah,
take me a
no.
while.
But
I
I
could
mean, you're
pull up
still
all the
like,
different
oh,
ones, but
you're still like more like over half of a standard deviation.
so again, so the mean was a D of 1.04.
Which
And
is
so you
huge.
had some countries at a D of like 1.5, 1.6, and
Right.
some other countries down to about a D of zero point 0.6. That was about as low as we got.
That's still big, though.
It's still big. Yes. And so that's what I mean. This is a very resilient difference in interests. It is moderated somewhat by country.
Yeah, and I mean that's still a quite a. I mean, we're speaking of generalities here, but that's still quite a large moderating effect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so the
Hmm.
culture, so if you think about these, culture can have clearly an impact in terms of our interests. I was arguing earlier, clearly has an impact in terms of job choice, and that's kind of makes obvious sense. But in terms of culture, clearly has an index of how much these things exist. They're still there, but clearly it can kind of shrink them.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. And so, and then in the case of sort of the anecdotal example that where you were talking about when you were giving these talks in China and Taiwan, what that was suggesting is that culture is influencing the career choices that women make, increasing the probability that they're going to be in some STEM fields. But and even though they were very successful on the outcome of satisfaction for some of them, because they were sort of culturally rewarded for going into those disciplines, that it resulted in a negative effect on their outcome of satisfaction.
And certainly in terms of satisfaction, these individuals obviously were very select since they were so very successful. Um, they could they had the luxury of kind of even thinking about another option,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's not going to be true for most people.
So when we think about this developmentally, when do sex differences, like how can we think about that or understand it developmentally as people are developing, as they're getting older, when these sort of sex differences show themselves, when they get strong, all that stuff?
I got a bunch of research there too. Part of this started with, I kind of wanted to know about that, and so I kind of got into kind of a fascinating area of assessing children. And developing tests that you can use on children. And when I started, was kind of like most people, and it's still very true. You kind of take an instrument that exists and you give it to kids. Um, you get garbage. And and so I kind of got waylaid for several years, kind of doing kind of studying valid assessment of children, using kind of paper and pencil. And so, because when you think about interests, these are pretty much things that exist inside us, inside our head. We could make, and there have been some real early studies looking at maybe kindergarten kids, looking at what they choose to play with, and you might make some inference about what the child's interested in. But those are some pretty big ifs and a lot of assumptions there. And, a lot of also that depends upon what kind of options the kid has to play with. So, I didn't want to kind of go that route because I had problems. So I really needed to kind of focus on getting kids to talk about what they like to do. And I found, and then, I could talk to them, but I also wanted to get a paper and pencil sort of thing. And so I found, after doing a lot of talking and testing, I apologize to my daughters. I use them and their friends a lot, and kind of, oh, I got to try this out for you. And I go, oh, not again, Dad. Back when they were young. About fourth grade, you can start to have kids take some self-rating scales. They can use a pretty basic kind of Likert type scale if you give them real clear examples of how to do that. You just can't do it. You have to walk them through things with things that they're familiar with. And so I found using food examples, how much do you like ice cream, as, kind of an extreme yes, to how much do you like Brussels sprouts? And so there they could kind of get a grasp of it, and then they could kind of go through and talk about things. Another thing I learned is, and this is, hindsight's wonderful, you kind of have to give them items that they actually can rate. So we had, in early versions, we kind of took a version of a measure that we give out to high school students. We thought it'd be kind of simple. And it had an item in there: how much do you like repairing cars? And these kids would answer, a whole lot. And we're going, they don't know anything about repairing cars. But it was kind of an aspirational thing. Oh, I would love to try and repair a car. So we kind of realized, no, we got to come down to things that they actually can do and have tried and they know they like. So it got pretty basic. How much do you like hammering nails? So it's a very basic kind of things, that items that they can identify as they have done, so they can make some assessment of whether or not they like it or not. And so both of those together, we developed inventory of children's activities, and it's very nice, and it's used in, I think, 32 countries now. But anyway, so what we found, we use this scale. Children's interests in kind of elementary school or grammar school were pretty high in general and fairly undifferentiated. So they didn't make a lot of differences between social type things and realistic type things. They kind of like things. They hit that transition to middle school, and everything dramatically dropped for everybody. And it was very surprising. Just 1 year later, boom, the bottom drops out. And the bottom especially dropped out for girls in R and I type things. They were all pretty high in elementary school, and then they just dropped. And then after that, as they go through middle school and high school, we found that pretty much all the interests kind of came back up again. They became more differentiated. I start learning that I like investigative things more than enterprising things. And so I start differentiating more and the interests come back up. And that happened with everybody in everything except girls in investigative and realistic areas. They stayed low. Um, and so that key time from um, elementary school to middle school really kind of, that was when all this stuff hit the fan. And so I don't know. My conjecture is this is a very flux time. You have puberty kicking in, and that makes people crazy in general. You have the shift to middle school where all of a sudden there's many, you don't have the sheltered environment. You are struck with all others. Competition takes on a whole new importance. Peer groups kind of take on a whole new importance than they did before that. And also just the cognitive changes at that time are key. Girls are actually a little bit faster in terms of being able to kind of think about these things more complexly than boys are. And again, interests kind of take a dive. And so all these things are kind of going on, which could account for it. But the implication of this is if we want to have people think about STEM, you can play around in high school all you want, but you missed the boat already. You want to capture them in middle school when it kind of tanks. And, because that's the key time. And that's the time you want to capture and get them interventions. Also, pragmatically, it's a key, not only for the interest, but for just pragmatics of moving into STEM areas. In middle school is when you take those math courses. There's a math track. If you do not sign up for those first math classes in middle school, you're at least a year behind everything else, and you cannot change gears in high school and go into this track. So the math track is really kind of nailed down, and that's a key time when these decisions get made. So if you want to keep options open, that's when you make the interventions. You make them before these choices have been made, because afterwards it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I see it kind of happening. There's a lot of research in terms of looking at changing interests. And most all of it, and some is very good, but most all of it just looks at, I go through these interventions and say girls become more interested in science. Fine. The drawback here is it ignores all the other interests. And so much of the research just goes, look, see, this intervention worked. No, it didn't, and then some of the follow-ups, they don't find them kind of following through, is because they ignored the fact that these other interests, the profile was very different. So if you ignore the fact that social interests are high, and I only focus on investigative, and I got the investigative scores to come up, I don't know, say a D of 0.3, the girls still have very high social interests, and that's going to drive things more than just that one score.
So I'm struck by how you're describing this. So kids up to 10, 11-ish, they're pretty undifferentiated. So it's when you look at their interests, they're on average all around-ish the same. There's not a huge dramatic. And then they hit that 12, 13 years old. Correct me if I'm wrong here on any of these. And sort of their
middle school is, yeah.
Yeah, and their overall interests just sort of drop. And then once they sort of get past that, then it starts to become more differentiated. So when it drops, it's still relatively flat.
And then they start differentiating after.
And then it starts to look more like an EKG, where it's some highs and some lows on different things. Okay. So one of the things, as you were talking and you were explaining, okay, so what could be the explanation for this? And one of the things that you said was the environmental one, which is kids going to middle school, right? So one of the things I was thinking about is I don't know if it's nationwide, but at least in British Columbia, well, actually, I don't even know if it's all the province, but at least in Vancouver, there is no middle school. So they stay in elementary school, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
until they go to high school. So I was thinking like that would be, there's sort of there'd be like an opportunity there for that sort of like to remove that variable
Right.
in British Columbia to
And so
see.
you could kind of look at, no, that's why I would think it would be cool. Um, is is it still like elementary school? Do you have kind of contained classes and that warm, the nice warm environment? Okay, so
Yeah,
then
I
it would
mean,
be kind of like that.
I mean that they're in the same school building with 5 year olds, with kindergartners.
Well,
And now they
but
often have like a separate playground. So, and again, I'm speaking
no,
very anecdotally based on my own kids. Um, because if you had 11 and 12 year olds with 5 year olds, the 5 year olds would just get stomped on, right? That would be no
right.
good.
Yeah, no,
But
you have to kind of do that.
but they're still in
Um,
the same space, generally speaking. And yes, they're like, they don't switch classes or
yeah,
whatever. It's
that's
still
just
a
so the
unified
larger
class.
thing, they still have a contained class, and so there's not going to be as much of the competition, the comparison, because my comparison pool is smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of one of the things about middle school is all of a sudden I go from a nice contained thing where I kind of know where I fit and how things work, um, good or bad, to a huge comparison pool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As we're having this conversation, this area is so interesting. As a person who sort of got into this field, sort of thinking as a traditional psychologist or even psychotherapist, which I tend to think some people would disagree with this, but I think the majority would agree that as a psychotherapist, your job is to best help your client, the person, which is typically the person who is sitting across from you. My job is not to benefit the world. My job is to benefit Steve or Joan or
Yeah.
whomever is sitting across from me. And that I'm noticing in this, or I'm feeling in this work, that tension. Because in a way, if we were to say it's mostly, which I'm not saying you're saying, but even if we were to say it's 90% of this is culturally based, that when I'm working with the 18, 19-year-old based on their interests, regardless of where they got to, how they got here, they're here. And so my job is to help them get into the occupation that they're going to do well in and be happiest in and live their best life in.
It's our goal.
Right. Which is in some ways different than the problem that we're talking about, which is much more of as a society, that we're pushing back on some of these, or concerned about some of these traditional gender roles, which I think is a reasonable thing to be concerned about. But like, it's sort of like, should we use the sex norm version or not the sex normed version? It's like, well, what is our goal, to most help our client, or is our goal to most influence society?
Um, well, I think we can kind of certainly interests in careers are not the only realm for these kind of ethical quandaries in practice. Because oftentimes what the client might be advocating, we might not think is the best avenue, but we still have to kind of support them for many things that they want to do. Um, so this is, certainly it is a difficult one. We can, so yeah, where is our responsibility? We want to make society better. And clearly that's a lot of what the whole STEM focus is on. Um, and so we can make interventions that help this. I like to think that we don't make, say, girls go through these STEM interventions kicking and screaming. Maybe there are parents that do that in hopes that this will be good. And yes, I have dressed my girls in blues and blacks and my boys, and I could never get pink on them. So in hopes of kind of doing things, but I think that I think there's always those tensions, and I would like to kind of at least talk about some of these with clients. But ultimately, yes, what is the goal? And what is the goal right now? Is my goal with this person help them expand options and they're on board with that? Is my goal with this person to help them kind of make some selections that have the highest probability of making them happy and doing well? And so those are two different goals. And these would be things that I'd be talking with and that we would be kind of clear on. It's not mine to decide. It shouldn't be. Um, Even if I strongly believe in it, these are, and this is, I don't view it as different from other decisions we make with our clients. Yes, we can kind of talk about it. And then once we agree to what we're going to do, then we do it.
So one more question I had about the sex difference stuff is, a while ago I had Nadia Fuad on the podcast. And so a big area of her work, which is girls, women in STEM.
Mm-hmm.
And she was really, one of the take homes that I had was that one of the, and she's done a bunch of work on engineering specifically. And so one of her take homes was one of the reasons that girls and women are underrepresented in engineering, maybe the primary reason, is because of what engineering culture, because engineering culture basically pushes them out.
Right.
And I guess I'd be curious what your thoughts were about that and how your work maybe speaks to that.
Well, again, the environment matters a whole lot. And that's kind of, some of that's kind of getting at the justification for the validity of the not sex norming. Because this way, the girls are not going to score high in INR. And engineering is INR. It's got no S whatsoever. I started out as an engineer, and that's one of the reasons I left, was because I really didn't like the engineers. They're not, there's no social contact. You didn't do that. That just wasn't part of what they did. And so, yes, it's a bad fit. And so, you can blame the engineering environment, but to some extent, this is what the people in these areas do. They're not social. You can't make them social. And so, yes, it is difficult. And so, yeah, maybe you can put in some support, some other ways around it, but ultimately the job is kind of an IR kind of thing. And so, yes, I that's a common finding with a lot of people is, yes, they're pushed out because their interests don't match what they're doing. And so they would like to get more. Most of the stuff I've seen is more social contact. I'd like to talk about these things, and that just doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Or, just general things, checking in with each other, or when people are having a little difficulty, just checking in with them. From my experience, that's not what engineers do. And they're fine with that.
Mm-hmm. So for the women, of course, we're speaking generalities, for some women who do have elevated INR, but also have, relative to men, many of the male engineers, elevations on S, that it becomes kind of an inhospitable environment, because how one would do training, how one would do problem solving, how one would do feedback, promotions, dealing with problems, challenges, whatever, that just, for many of the folks there, because they have practically zero S, that a person who even has moderate levels of S is just going to feel, like a fish on land.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of how things get started, how things get talked about, you have group projects, and and I'm sure you've seen some of these. The group project comes down to, okay, you do that, I'll do this, and then we'll get back together and put them together. Versus, well, let's talk about this. What are the different ways of doing this? We could kind of do it together. Very different ways of approaching a task.
That's, this is something I've noticed even in my work and I've made this, and I hadn't linked it with interests, but one of the things I've noticed is many of my colleagues who are women, that when they're working on a paper with their collaborators, how they do it is so much different than how I or most men do it.
Mm-hmm.
I have, one of my colleagues, what she does is, particularly with her co-author who she does a lot of her work with, is both of them will simultaneously be in a Google Doc co-writing, right? To me, I have never done anything like that. To me, what co-authorship looks like is one of us does the majority of the work and then sends it to the other person who's going to give feedback and track changes and sends it back, or something like that. Or maybe you'll write a little bit of it, but it's much more autonomous.
Yeah.
Just there's a couple of touch points, but and I see that in the difference between the men and women in our world. And I think, and part of me, I always say, part of me is somewhat envious of how women typically do it, because it's like, oh, that sounds nice. Like, I really like my colleagues and my collaborators. Like, it would be kind of nice to spend more time with them and sort of be like co-working on these things more in more of those social contexts. But
Not
it is
something I've ever done, and it would make me absolutely crazy.
Right. Isn't that interesting though?
Yeah. But I think part of that is, no, I would have a hard time in that context separating the work part. Well, a few problems, but one is separating the work part from just the socializing part.
Right.
And it's kind of like I would get distracted. We'd go off on that tangent. We'd go off on this tangent. I can't see myself getting a whole lot written. So, that's one. Unless we were real clear about, okay, we got to stay on task. And the other one is, I get in the zone, and I gotta be in my zone. So when I'm writing,
right, but it's just like the idea of it is just like just pushes you, get pushed away from the idea of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting. Okay, so I have a handful of sort of miscellaneous questions, if you don't mind, that I can jump to.
For.
Okay, so one of them, so the Personal Globe Inventory. So in preparation for this, I took the measure, and one of the interesting things about the PGI is you assess interests in the PGI. So just to be clear, what that looks like is a whole bunch of lists of occupations where people rate the occupations from 1 to 7 on how much they like them. So, some examples. So you just say sculptor, you just say banker, you say social worker, and people 1 to 7, right, for 100 plus occupations. And there's different versions of the measure. So there's shorter versions, longer versions. Then you also have 2 additional scales. So you also have a liking scale and a competence scale. So for the liking scale, folks rate how much they, from strongly dislike to strongly like. And for the competence, from unable to do to very competent. And you have specific tasks. So you have things like write poetry, help others, repair computers. And for each one of those, the person rates their assessment of how much they would like to do something like that. And you explicitly say, this is like, don't think about how good you are at this. Just, would you like to do it? Like when I took it, I was like, oh, write poetry. I'll put that as a 3, but my competence would be a 1. And then you also have them rate their competence for those exact same items. So just sort of curious about your thinking about both interests as well as liking and competence, and including all 3 of them simultaneously.
Well, really, the interest is the liking part. So the first part is I had several scales. One was rating occupations, and then I also have the activities where you do liking or competence. So
okay.
But, there is a lot of thinking about, self-efficacy. People choose things that they feel efficacious in. Um, and so I kind of wanted to capture both. Liking and self-efficacy are correlated, but they're far from isomorphic.
And when you say isomorphic, you mean?
The same.
Hmm.
So if I like something, I feel competent in it. No. But generally, that's true. So they are correlated, but they're not the same. And so, and then I did a bunch of research on them and the say social cognitive theory posits that interests lead to competence. Um, and so, uh, and some other people posit the opposite. If I'm good at it, I learn to like it. Um, and so my research kind of looked at longitudinal stuff. And over time, yeah, interests lead to competence and competence leads to interest. And they both kind of reciprocally are related to each other, but they're not the same. So, in your case, say you were interested in poetry and you have absolutely no self confidence in your ability to do that. Fine. This is kind of where you're at, and that's fine. What you see when you put these together is sometimes people have some pretty interesting profiles. Most people, they agree. My profile agrees. But some people, and they'll have a profile where, say, and this is actually a fairly common one I saw a lot with kind of engineers. Um, a lot of competence in terms of math and science. Feel good about their ability to do that in their engineering and their working. Um, and um, but not as much interest in it. They're starting to find it boring. But they have a high interest in kind of the social things, kind of like those women I was talking about in Taiwan and China, but no perceptions of competence in those areas. And so this presents a real dilemma for these people because, I'm in a field, I'm good at it, but I hate it. Um, and, one of the big things, particularly for engineers, is they can only go so far and then comes a shift that if they want to go ahead, they have to move into management. Um, and many of them have no interest, skill in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a rare bird that has those skills and can move forward. But here, this one person's profile was he didn't feel good enough with his ability to do that. So that became kind of the focus for this person, is to kind of have to build some self-confidence. Because clearly he wanted to do this. He wanted to highlight working with others, but just felt bad about his ability to do that. And so they can disagree, and it provides some real interesting data to kind of, particularly if you're working with a client. But generally, they agree.
Got it. Okay. So do you have a sense of what's more important in terms of, and obviously there's different outcomes, right? But like in terms of their association with outcomes?
I mean, interest or
Efficacy?
competence perceptions. Um, Again, they're kind of be pretty highly correlated. My guess is, and this is strictly a guess, is interests. Because if I approach things, I will spend time doing it, and I'm going to get better at it. If I'm competent, yeah, but I might not approach them. Interests are probably the driving mechanism for me to go near something. And so if I kind of go in and if I'm interested, I'll try it even if I stink for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about was the application of interests in working with clients. And obviously it's come up a few times in our conversation. But I think that it's not unusual to hear someone say, yeah, my university career counselor said that I should be a flight attendant. What do they know? And they, and throw out the whole thing.
And we all have. What was mine? I took the strong in high school, and I was going to be a forest ranger. Um, so yeah, you get all you can always get strange results, but I think that's the probability of getting something like that is higher if you just give a test and let them go. But anybody who kind of sat down with these clients, it clearly is you're giving them not just these supposed answers, you're giving them a structure for how to think about this. So if I just took Holland's model, if I could get them to understand Holland's model, I could get them to understand how these choices could be made. And, when I talk to that person about, okay, so you got a high score here. And so what are the types of things you like doing? And the person will soon see that, all the things that they're approaching, all the things that they like are kind of fall right here. And so while maybe this one occupation isn't the one you thought that is a good fit, but if you can get them to understand the structure of the scale, they can kind of go, oh, yeah, okay, I see that pretty much all the stuff I do is R. Um, and so that helps me understand things I'm going to like. That helps me understand things I could think about. And it also helps me eliminate a whole lot of other stuff that I'm not going to be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
It might also help, and sometimes this is good, particularly with younger clients. A lot of them don't know some of the interest areas. And so you might want to, you say to them, well, like, have you ever done this? Well, no. And so you get them to try some of the other areas that they, clearly they're saying that they don't know anything about. Again, that's the exploration kind of thing. And so a test gives not just supposed answers, but really a structure for how to think about it. And so when I'm working with somebody, I get them to go, what kind of things do you like? What do you do? And we start there, and then I talk a little bit about the model. And I go, see, this is kind of what you got here, and these are realistic things, and you've been doing all of these different things, they're all real similar. Oh, I guess I didn't realize that before. And so you're giving them a very simple way to kind of explain it. And that's really what the test is doing. How can I make sense of the world? Because I have to make some big decisions. And here, that can help me eliminate a lot of things. And it can help me even focus in more closely on things that are important.
It strikes me that interest inventories are something that it's an underutilized tool by psychotherapists that generally we think about this is something that's done by your, at the career center or by a career counselor or someone like that.
You go give the test and they give you the answers and you're out.
Right. And that unless I'm at, unless I'm in high school, in university, maybe if I'm switching careers, but unless I'm sort of at those couple of developmental points or transition points, this is not a thing. And it strikes me particularly with with your measure that where you have that interests and competence, sort of both of those scales, that it gives you the ability, when you have a client who's struggling at work, let's say, right, which is pretty common, or not, and that could mean lots of different things, right? The example of the women that you gave, they were, in terms of how their bosses, their managers, no, they're superstars, right? They're doing great. So in that sense, they're not struggling at work at all, but they don't like it very much. So in that sense, they're really struggling at work. That by giving a tool like this, it allows you perhaps to see like, okay, where is this? Maybe there's just some mismatches going on. So you're spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week, whatever it is, not really aligned with what you're interested in. How is there a way that we could work or think about this in a way that could get you more aligned?
Well, I think one of the possible benefits of it is it presents information about the lack of alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people, I'm going to work, I'm not happy, I'm kind of struggling through, but I'm doing okay, but I just don't. This gives some nice, clear, concrete evidence of what exactly is going on and where the discrepancies are and where it needs to be attended to versus just kind of feeling like things suck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think, it is an interesting thing and something that I do think, I don't know. Yeah. It's not something, and it is interesting too in our training that for those of us in programs that do train on sort of career vocational related stuff, that we really do often separate these things, and that we probably do a disservice by not integrating them more in the training, right? That when folks are in our in-house clinic, that as client situations arise where maybe this would be valuable, that we don't even think to sort of suggest it for the student to work with the client in this particular context.
Oh, I agree. I recall, in my internship, way back, I had, I, like many people, kind of kept career focus and real meat, emotional, social issues separate. And I remember I had this client who was really kind of torn up about some career issues. And I talked to my supervisor, go, what should I be doing here? So he goes, it's the same thing. It's not any different. You're making choices, and we think we can minimize them by just kind of, oh, it's a simple choice. If you think about what we're asking people to do, this is probably the biggest choice they'll make in their entire life.
Mm-hmm.
It determines who they are. I introduce myself as having a certain occupation. People know me that way. It's perhaps more than any other choice that we make, and yet we minimize it.
Okay, random question, and then we'll sort of close up. One of the things that struck me as I was taking, particularly the PGI, where it's just the interests, and so it lists the professions, and then you rate the professions. As I was taking it, I was thinking, okay, so social worker, but there's so many different facets of being a social worker, So I'm sort of rating it based on this large conceptualization that I have. But what gets lost in that, right, is like there's 1,000 different things a social worker does in their day to day. And when you were talking about the tool that you developed for kids, how much do I like hammering a nail? So like that's so much more specific and focused. And so it's sort of intuitively, and maybe I'm wrong about this, it seems like that's almost a better way at getting at the areas of the domains of interest because it's so much more specific, right? That is clearly realistic. Where if I say construction foreman or something
Mm-hmm.
like that, there's the realistic part of that, but there's also the social part of that. So I guess I was just sort of curious about, using the occupations as a way to, as the stimuli to have people respond to these interest inventories versus more of the specific tasks.
Well, yeah, if you notice, they're both their activities and the occupations.
Right.
I moved away from the occupations one. So really, you took a very old version of the test. Um, for several reasons. One, just that, and the other one is you can't translate occupations across
Right.
countries. So it's just I started out early on, and I'm kind of you go like I had like bartender, and we were translating it into Farsi, and my people were saying there's no such thing as a bartender. We don't serve alcohol. And that's just an example. Dancing, and we had several Some cultures just don't do that. So yes, we kind of pitched the occupations for just those reasons, and so we focus much more on the activities because they're much more straightforward. Activities occur in all cultures, but the occupations don't.
No, great. Okay. I feel validated. Thanks. Okay. So, a question I ask everybody is what kind of pushback, if any, have you had towards your work?
Well, obviously the big one is who cares about interests, um, and you know, more what we need another interest measure. Um, so those are probably the big ones. I've gotten a whole lot more attention internationally than I have in the U.S. for the PGI and the children's measure. Um, and I think that the part of that is internationally the prestige. I mean, here in America, a lot of people go, I don't like that. I don't even want to think about that. But internationally, they seem to, that's just part of the world. So they seem much more amenable to it. Um, and also, in many of these countries, they're very interested. So, I look at some of the countries I've worked with, they're becoming, say, more prosperous, or things are changing so much that they need some help, some guidance to help people make decisions. Because if you think about many of these countries, what are you going to do for an occupation? You did what your parents did, and that was just the way things were. But as this starts deteriorating more and more across the world, and things are opening up more, we can say, "Oh, that's good because we're really allowing these things to happen." But think about the cost to the people in those positions. How do you then make decisions about where you're going to go? So if we open opportunities, that's great, but it also presents a huge burden on the individuals for how to deal with that. And so a lot of these countries have been looking for interest tests to kind of help people do some of that, because they didn't have there are no structures in place to facilitate that. And I think in the U.S. we see much more. The average person has much more occupational information about what kind of things go into different jobs, and they see that their parents doing a whole bunch of different things, a whole bunch of other people doing different things, and so they start to get some ideas pretty early about at least some of that, a cursory knowledge of the world of work. Other countries, they don't have that. They don't have norms. Um, Parents can't tell them how to choose a job. They never had to. Whereas, my father and mother could at least give me some guidance about how to think about doing this.
Have you gotten much pushback for the gender or sex work that you've done? Yeah,
Have I
it's
gotten what?
much pushback in terms of the sex difference? Or
Um, Not that much. I mean, the biggest one, and I alluded to, is gender is not dichotomous.
right.
And so, what can you do about that? And if I want to help people, how can I even think about doing that for somebody that doesn't want to fall into one of these two groups comfortably?
Mm-hmm.
And I hope the field kind of can start picking that up. And particularly now that we could start getting some more information and getting larger samples on the internet, I think we can start making real
Mm-hmm.
headway in that area. The other one is, again, definitional issue. Okay. So if we can get a whole lot of people who do identify as non-binary, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Can we just keep them? Can we just have three groups?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a valid representation? My guess is no,
Mm-hmm.
but that's just my guess.
Yeah, I mean, just my intuition, which is very immature, is that this is like we could think about this more as a continuum,
Yeah. Well,
and
but
that
then,
these data could be
kind of how do
collected.
you divide that up?
Right.
In kind of looking at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and would a continuum be a valid representation? Because certainly I know some people that do not view themselves on a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
I could have this continuum, but I'm here. I'm on a different line.
Oh, okay.
So I am more than just somewhere between these two.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you sent me a few papers and resources that I'll link to in the show notes. But are there any other resources that you want listeners to know about who are interested in what we've been talking about?
Oh God, I don't know.
And I guess so. I believe that all of the tools that you've created are available for free, right?
Well, one of my sad stories is the PGI is remarkably, I've had that up online for a long time.
For
And then
free.
I got it all fancied. I gussied it up and made it pretty sexy. And it was on the ASU server, and they promised me 5 years. that they'd support it, and they didn't. And so it's now down, and so it currently isn't up anywhere, much to my chagrin. So,
But the pencil and paper version
oh yeah, those are, yeah.
is available for free.
Oh yeah, no, and any of this you want to use it, go ahead. And the kids one, yeah, you can get all the stuff on my website. You can just download it. You can't take the test, but these are there to use. I think the kids version. The PGI has some real short ones you could use in research. You could add it in there. The children's scale you can do. One of the things I was playing with toward the end there was, and I built this into the PGI too, response latency. So I assessed how long it took you to respond to the items. And I found that it did correlate to roughly your liking or disliking of an occupation. But it added a lot of reliability to my assessment. It didn't do anything different. I thought maybe it would be like implicit assessment. It would really capture something different. No, it didn't capture anything different. But it was like asking the same item twice. So I found that I could cut, if I took account of response latency, I could cut the scale in half and get the same reliability. So,
because how quickly or slowly I answer the question tells me what.
So, if you think about it, if I'm real sure about something, fast.
Right. It's going to be a 1 or a 7 or whatever quickly.
So if I do a 1 or a 7 fast, that tells me this is a strong response. If I take a while, it's kind of like, well, I'm thinking about it. Do I really like that? Maybe. So this is true with many things they've in response stuff, but they haven't talked about it in terms of the actual assessments before. So you can use this as a way of really cutting down lengths of questionnaires.
Got it. So like for if it's realistic or things that if I rate that as a 7, I'll also likely rate it really quickly. So that sort of like becomes 2 data points, which is equivalent to roughly having kind of 2 items.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
So you could roughly cut a scale in half.
Wow, which is great. So great. So I will link all of these things, Terry. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate this. This is wonderful.
Oh, no, it's fun to do.
Thanks so much for watching. If you found it helpful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video where we continue exploring the science of psychotherapy and applied psychology.